I never thought my peaceful Tuesday morning would end with discovering that my neighbor had been secretly recording my private conversations for months. But there I was, staring at Mrs. Patterson, holding a digital recorder with my own voice playing back words I never remembered saying. She stood at our shared fence line, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing that floral house coat she seemed to live in, but her expression was nothing like the sweet, elderly woman I thought I knew. The recording crackled with static, as my voice seemed to promise help paying for her daughter Brittany's college tuition at Stanford. I felt my stomach drop as she rewound the device and played it again this time, with a smug smile spreading across her weathered face. She had somehow edited together fragments of different conversations, splicing my responses from completely unrelated discussions about neighborhood events into what sounded like a binding agreement to sell my newly inherited lakefront cabin. The knocking on my front door came exactly 48 hours later, just as Mrs. Patterson had promised. I opened it to find her standing beside a tall man in an expensive navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his cold blue eyes surveyed me like I was already guilty of something. "Quinn, this is my brother-in-law, Derek," Mrs. Patterson announced, her voice carrying a false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "He's here about our little agreement." Derek stepped forward without invitation, extending his hand in a gesture that felt more like a threat than a greeting. "Derek Patterson, attorney at law. I believe you and my sister-in-law have some business to discuss regarding educational funding obligations." I shook his hand reluctantly, noticing how his grip lingered just long enough to feel intimidating. "I'm not sure what you mean." "We don't have any agreement." Mrs. Patterson's laugh sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Quinn, don't be silly. You remember signing that document at the neighborhood barbecue 6 months ago?" Derek opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, withdrawing a manila folder that he handled like it contained state secrets. Inside was a single sheet of paper that made my blood run cold. It was my signature, clear as day, on what appeared to be a promissory note pledging to provide financial assistance for Brittany Patterson's educational expenses. "This is impossible," I whispered, taking the document with trembling hands. "I never signed anything like this." But there it was, my name written in my own handwriting at the bottom of a page that committed me to helping fund a Stanford education. The paper looked official, complete with legal terminology about educational support, obligations, and repayment schedules. My mind raced back to that barbecue, trying to remember what Mrs. Patterson had asked me to sign. Then it hit me like a punch to the gut. The petition. She had approached me while I was flipping burgers, asking if I would sign a neighborhood petition to improve our street lighting. I'd barely glanced at it, just scrawled my name, and handed it back while joking with my neighbor Tom about his overcooked hot dogs. "You transferred my signature?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't what I signed." Derek's smile was as sharp as a knife blade. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Quinn. Are you suggesting that my client engaged in document fraud?" Mrs. Patterson clutched her chest dramatically. "Quinn? How could you say such a thing after all the times I've brought you homemade cookies and watched your house when you traveled for work? I trusted you with my daughter's future." I examined the signature more closely, noticing subtle differences in the paper texture and ink density that suggested sophisticated forgery techniques. Someone had carefully cut my signature from the original petition and transferred it to this fabricated document using methods that would fool casual inspection. "This is fraud," I stated firmly, but Derek was already pulling out more papers. "What's fraud is breaking a promise to help a deserving young woman achieve her educational dreams," he replied smoothly. "My client has been planning Brittany's Stanford attendance based on your verbal commitment and this signed agreement. The emotional and financial damages are considerable." Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that appeared conveniently from her purse. "Brittany has been so excited about Stanford. She's already told all her friends that her generous neighbor Quinn was helping make her dreams come true. Derek spread additional documents across my dining room table without asking permission. Mrs. Patterson has spoken with several neighbors who witnessed your agreement to help fund Brittany's education. They're prepared to testify about your specific commitments made during neighborhood gatherings. My heart sank as I recognized the implications. Mrs. Patterson had been systematically building a case against me, manipulating social situations to create false witnesses and fabricated evidence. She had researched property transfer laws and found ways to exploit legal loopholes involving verbal contracts and community testimony. Furthermore, Derek continued, we filed a preliminary lien against your inherited property pending resolution of this matter. Your lakefront cabin cannot be sold or transferred until you fulfill your obligations to my client. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone and showed me a real estate listing template already filled out with details about my cabin. I've already contacted Patricia Williams from Lakeshore Realty. She's prepared to list your property immediately once you agree to proceed. The current market analysis suggests we can get $320,000, which will cover Brittany's 4-year Stanford expenses quite comfortably. The casual way she discussed selling my grandfather's cabin, the place where I had spent every childhood summer learning to fish and camp, felt like she was ripping out pieces of my soul. That cabin represented 5 generations of family memories, built by my great-great-grandfather in 1923, and lovingly maintained by each generation since. Derek handed me a business card with gold embossing. You have 72 hours to contact Mrs. Patterson and arrange for the property listing, or we'll proceed with legal action for breach of contract and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages will be considerably higher than the original educational support amount. After they left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the fraudulent documents, trying to understand how my quiet suburban life had suddenly become a legal nightmare. Mrs. Patterson had clearly been planning this scheme for months, possibly since learning about my inheritance through neighborhood gossip or intercepted mail. I called my friend Jake, a paralegal who worked downtown, and arranged to meet him that evening. As I explained the situation over coffee, his expression grew increasingly grim. Quinn, this is more sophisticated than typical neighborhood disputes, Jake warned. Whoever helped her forge that signature knew exactly what they were doing. The preliminary lien means they've already taken legal steps that will be expensive and time-consuming to challenge. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Patterson's smug expression and heard Derek's threatening tone. They had turned my inheritance, my grandfather's final gift, into a weapon against me, using my own generosity and community trust as tools for their elaborate con game. 3 days later, I drove the 2 hours to Stanford University, determined to understand exactly what Brittany's financial situation really was. The campus sprawled across 8,000 acres of California hills, with red-tiled roofs and sandstone buildings that whispered of academic prestige and enormous tuition costs. I found the financial aid office in the basement of an administrative building where fluorescent lights buzzed over rows of anxious students clutching paperwork. After waiting 45 minutes, I was directed to Janet Morrison, a middle-aged counselor with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. I'm here about Brittany Patterson, I explained carefully. There seems to be some confusion about her family's financial situation. Janet's expression immediately shifted to concern. Are you a family member? I can only discuss student information with authorized parties. I showed her Derek's fraudulent documents. According to these papers, I'm supposedly obligated to help fund her education. But I believe there's been some misunderstanding. Janet studied the documents with practiced efficiency. Mr. Quinn? I remember Brittany's case quite clearly. She submitted additional financial documentation 3 weeks ago, claiming that a family friend who had been supporting her education suddenly withdrew his assistance. My hands clenched into fists. What kind of documentation? Janet pulled up Brittany's file on her computer, her frown deepening as she scrolled through the information. Bank statements showing regular payments from your account to her previous school expenses over the past 3 years. letters from her mother describing your long-standing commitment to her daughter's education, and a personal statement from Brittany herself detailing how your sudden withdrawal of support has created severe emotional and financial distress. The room seemed to spin around me. Those bank statements are completely fabricated. I've never made any payments for Brittany's education. I barely know the girl. Janet's eyes widened with alarm. Mr. Quinn, if that's true, then we're looking at serious fraud. Brittany broke down crying during her appointment, describing how you had become like a second father to her and then cruelly abandoned your promises when she needed you most. I felt sick imagining that poor girl being manipulated into believing I had betrayed her. Can you show me what she submitted? Janet hesitated, then pulled out a thick folder. Normally I couldn't share this, but given the circumstances, the bank statements looked completely authentic, showing monthly transfers from my checking account to something called Patterson Educational Fund, dating back 3 years. The amount started small, $200 monthly, then gradually increased to $800 per month. The total showed I had supposedly contributed over $17,000 to Brittany's schooling. But I recognized subtle errors that revealed the forgeries. The bank routing numbers were slightly incorrect, and the statement dates didn't align with actual monthly cycles my bank used. Someone had created sophisticated fake documents using advanced desktop publishing software and detailed knowledge of banking procedures. Mrs. Patterson gave Brittany very specific instructions about what to say. Janet continued. The girl seemed genuinely heartbroken, describing family dinners where you discussed her Stanford dreams and promised to help make them reality. I studied Brittany's handwritten personal statement, seeing tears stains on the paper where she had written about feeling abandoned and confused by my sudden change of heart. Mrs. Patterson had coached her daughter to believe in elaborate fiction, using the girl's genuine emotions to manipulate Stanford's compassionate review process. There's more, Janet said reluctantly. Brittany's mother contacted our Veterans Services Coordinator, claiming that Brittany's biological father abandoned the family and stopped providing financial support. She submitted documentation showing he had failed to make required educational contributions despite military deployment pay. My stomach dropped. Brittany's father is military. According to the records, Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez has been deployed overseas for 18 months with no contact to his daughter. Mrs. Patterson claimed he became angry about the deployment orders and cut off all family financial support as punishment. This was getting worse by the minute. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just targeting me, she was destroying a military family's relationship and stealing from a soldier serving overseas. I thought about Marcus Rodriguez probably lying awake in some foreign base, worried about his daughter's future, and unaware that his ex-wife was systematically destroying their family bonds. Janet pulled out another folder. We also received contact from your employer's Human Resources Department. Someone claiming to be a legal representative submitted paperwork requesting wage garnishment for unpaid educational support obligations. I nearly fell out of my chair. My employer, a Marcus Thompson, contacted Data Flow Solutions yesterday, providing court documents that demand payroll deductions of $1,200 monthly until your educational debt is satisfied. Your supervisor, Sarah Chen, called our office asking for verification. Mrs. Patterson's scheme was expanding beyond property theft into employment sabotage. She was systematically attacking every aspect of my life, using fake legal documents to convince my workplace that I was a deadbeat who owed child support for educational expenses. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah immediately. Sarah, it's Quinn. I need to explain about those documents HR received. Quinn, thank God you called. Sarah's voice carried genuine relief. Marcus Thompson was very persuasive, but something felt off about his paperwork. The legal formatting didn't match standard court documents, and he couldn't provide a case number when I asked. I explained the entire situation while Janet listened with growing amazement. Sarah promised to forward Thompson's contact information and block any garnishment attempts until the matter was resolved through proper legal channels. Mr. Quinn. Janet said after I hung up, "This is the most elaborate education fraud scheme I've encountered in 15 years. Mrs. Patterson has created an entire fictional narrative involving you, her daughter, and apparently Brittany's biological father." She handed me a card for Stanford's security office. "You need to report this immediately. If they're submitting false financial aid documents, it affects federal funding and could constitute wire fraud." As I drove home, my mind raced with the implications. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just stealing my property. She was destroying Brittany's relationship with her father, manipulating a young woman's emotions, defrauding a university, and sabotaging my career. The scope of her deception was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. That evening, I sat in my grandfather's old recliner looking through family photos of summers spent at the cabin. Every picture reminded me of what Mrs. Patterson was trying to steal, not just property, but 5 generations of family history and the last connection to my grandfather's love. But now I realized she was doing something even worse to Brittany and Marcus Rodriguez. She was stealing their family bonds using lies and manipulation to turn a father and daughter against each other while profiting from their pain. I picked up my phone and began researching private investigators. Mrs. Patterson had declared war on multiple families, and it was time to fight back with professional help. I pulled into my driveway Thursday evening after a grueling day at work, still trying to process everything Janet had told me about the fraud scheme. But as I stepped out of my car, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. 23 of my neighbors were gathered in Mrs. Patterson's backyard, sitting in folding chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle, like some kind of informal tribunal. Mrs. Patterson spotted me and waved enthusiastically. "Quinn, perfect timing. We're having a little community meeting about neighborhood values and keeping our promises to each other." I approached, slowly recognizing faces I had known for years. There was Robert Hayes, our neighborhood association president, along with Tom and Linda from 3 houses down. The elderly Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, and even Amanda, the teenage babysitter from across the street, was there with her parents. "What kind of meeting?" I asked, though my gut already knew this was another trap. Robert stood up, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "Quinn, we need to discuss your commitment to helping Brittany Patterson with her college expenses. Some concerning information has come to light." Mrs. Patterson moved to a laptop computer set up on a card table, clicking a few keys with practiced efficiency. "I thought it would be helpful to show everyone the conversation where you made your generous offer to support Brittany's Stanford education." A large monitor flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be security camera footage from Mrs. Patterson's backyard. The timestamp showed a date from 6 months ago, the same weekend as the neighborhood barbecue. In the video, I could clearly see myself standing near the fence line, appearing to nod and respond enthusiastically while Mrs. Patterson spoke. But something was wrong. The audio didn't match what I remembered from that conversation. So you understand how important Brittany's education is to our family, Mrs. Patterson's voice came through the speakers. My recorded voice responded clearly, "Absolutely, I want to help make that happen." "And you're willing to sell your property to fund her Stanford tuition?" "Yes, that sounds like the right thing to do." The crowd murmured approvingly, but I stood there in shock. I remembered that conversation completely differently. Mrs. Patterson had been talking about her garden renovation project, asking if I thought it was important to invest in beautifying our neighborhood. My responses about wanting to help and doing the right thing had been about supporting community landscaping improvements, not college funding. "The audio has been manipulated," I said loudly, but my voice cracked with the stress of the situation. Mrs. Patterson looked hurt. "Quinn, how can you say that this is straight from my security system? Are you claiming I somehow fabricated your own voice?" Tom stood up, shaking his head disappointedly. "Quinn, I was at that barbecue. I heard you talking about helping Brittany. You seemed really excited about supporting her dreams." "But that's not what we were discussing," I protested. "She was asking about her garden project." Linda crossed her arms. I remember you saying you wanted to do something meaningful with your inheritance. Helping a deserving student seems pretty meaningful to me. I realized with growing horror that Mrs. Patterson had spent months carefully planting false memories in our neighbors' minds. During casual conversations at community events, she had mentioned my supposed commitment to Brittany's education, gradually convincing people they had witnessed something that never happened. Robert pulled out a clipboard with multiple signatures. Quinn 18 of your neighbors have signed this petition asking you to honor your commitment to Brittany. We all believe in keeping our word, especially when it involves helping young people achieve their potential. Mrs. Patterson dabbed her eyes again with that ever-present tissue. I've been hosting coffee mornings for the past several weeks, and everyone has been so touched by your generosity. Poor Brittany has been telling her Stanford classmates about her wonderful neighbor who believed in her dreams. Amanda, who couldn't be more than 17, raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Quinn, my mom says you promised to sell your cabin to help pay for college. That's like really inspiring. I hope someone helps me like that when I graduate. The manipulation was masterful. Mrs. Patterson had created an entire community narrative where I was either a generous benefactor keeping his word or a heartless liar who betrayed a deserving young woman. Every neighbor now had a vested interest in believing her version of events. Mrs. Patterson, can you play that video again? I asked, studying the footage more carefully. As it replayed, I noticed subtle discrepancies that revealed the sophisticated editing. My mouth movements didn't perfectly sync with the audio, and there were barely perceptible cuts where different conversations had been spliced together. The lighting on my face shifted slightly between responses, indicating footage from different times had been combined. But explaining technical video editing to 23 neighbors who wanted to believe in a heartwarming story about community support seemed impossible. Mrs. Patterson had chosen her audience carefully, not people who knew me as a decent person but didn't have the technical expertise to detect professional-level digital manipulation. Look, Robert said. Consulting notes written on index cards, Mrs. Patterson shared specific details about your conversations. You supposedly mentioned that your grandfather would have wanted you to use the cabin inheritance to help deserving young people. You talked about how isolated you felt since his death, and how supporting Brittany would give your life new purpose. My hands trembled with rage. She had taken my private grief about losing my grandfather and twisted it into justification for her fraud. During casual fence-line conversations, I had indeed mentioned feeling lost after his death and wondering about his hopes for my future. Mrs. Patterson had recorded those vulnerable moments and weaponized them against me. You also mentioned Stanford specifically, added Mrs. Chen in her gentle voice. You said you researched the tuition costs and felt confident your property sale would cover everything Brittany needed. That was impossible. I had never researched Stanford's tuition costs until 3 days ago when I drove to their campus. But Mrs. Patterson had done the research and fed that information to neighbors as if it came from me. Furthermore, Mrs. Patterson said, producing another folder, I have documentation about your recent financial activities that support your ability to follow through on this commitment. She spread papers across the table showing detailed knowledge of my inheritance amount, property tax assessments, and even my employment salary. The documents revealed she knew exactly how much money my cabin was worth and had calculated precise figures to make her demands seem reasonable rather than extortive. Mrs. Patterson, how did you obtain my private financial information? I demanded. Oh, Quinn, you mentioned most of this during our friendly chats, she replied smoothly. You were quite open about your grandfather's estate and the property values. I simply did some additional research to help you understand your options. The crowd was nodding along, convinced that I had voluntarily shared financial details that Mrs. Patterson had actually obtained through illegal means. She had probably intercepted my mail-accessed public property records and possibly even hacked my personal accounts to gather this information. Robert consulted his clipboard again. Quinn, we're not trying to force you into anything. But as your neighbors and friends, we strongly encourage you to keep your word to Brittany. Her mother has shared how excited the girl is about starting Stanford with your support. As I looked around at these familiar faces, people I had known for years who had always seemed reasonable and fair, I realized Mrs. Patterson had successfully turned my entire community against me. She had created a sophisticated web of lies, manipulated evidence and false memories that made me appear to be the villain in a story about broken promises and disappointed dreams. The meeting ended with uncomfortable handshakes and disappointed looks. As neighbors filed back to their homes, Mrs. Patterson approached me with that same smug smile. "Quinn, I hope you'll reconsider your position," she said softly. "It would be such a shame if this matter had to be resolved through unpleasant legal proceedings. Brittany has been through enough disappointment already." Standing alone in my driveway watching the porch lights flicker on across the neighborhood, I felt completely isolated. Mrs. Patterson had systematically destroyed my community relationships while building an elaborate fraud case that seemed impossible to disprove. But as I walked toward my front door, something inside me shifted from shock to determination. Mrs. Patterson had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated how much my grandfather's cabin meant to me and how far I would go to protect it. It was time to stop being a victim and start fighting back. The process server arrived at 7:15 on Monday morning, just as I was leaving for work. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who apologized 3 times while handing me an official-looking envelope marked "Urgent Legal Documents. Immediate response required." "Sorry about the early hour," he mumbled. Mr. Patterson insisted this needed immediate service. I tore open the envelope with shaking hands, finding court papers that made my worst fears seem optimistic. Derek Patterson, acting as attorney for Linda Patterson, was suing me for $287,000 in educational support obligations, plus an additional $100,000 in punitive damages for emotional distress and breach of fiduciary duty. The lawsuit claimed I had entered into a verbal contract to serve as Brittany's unofficial educational guardian, accepting responsibility for her college expenses in exchange for her emotional dependency and academic performance. Derek argued that my sudden withdrawal of promised support had caused severe psychological trauma, requiring professional counseling, and had disrupted Brittany's academic planning at a critical juncture in her life. But the most devastating part was the list of witnesses prepared to testify against me. Mrs. Chen was scheduled to describe conversations where I supposedly discussed specific tuition payment schedules. Amanda, the teenage babysitter, would testify about hearing me promise to take care of everything regarding Brittany's Stanford expenses. Frank Martinez. Our mail carrier was prepared to confirm that I had received multiple Stanford financial aid documents and discussed payment obligations during his daily rounds. I called in sick to work and drove straight to the courthouse where I learned that Derek had filed the case in small claims court rather than regular civil court. This was strategically brilliant. Small claims procedures were more informal, with relaxed evidence rules that would make the doctored recordings and manipulated documents harder to challenge effectively. The clerk explained that small claims court focused on fairness rather than technical legal procedures, meaning the judge would likely consider community testimony and relationship history more heavily than forensic document analysis. Derek had chosen a venue where Mrs. Patterson's elaborate social manipulation would be most effective. "The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today," the clerk informed me. "You'll need to file your response within 5 business days if you intend to contest the claims." I spent the afternoon at the law library researching fraud and conspiracy statutes while trying to understand my legal options. The more I read, the more I realized how sophisticated Mrs. Patterson's scheme really was. She had structured everything to fall within legal gray areas where intent was difficult to prove and community testimony could outweigh physical evidence. That evening, I met with Jake at a coffee shop downtown. His expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the court papers. "Quinn, this is way beyond neighborhood dispute territory," he said, setting down the documents with obvious concern. "Derek Patterson has filed this case with the precision of someone who's done it before. The witness list, the damage calculations, even the choice of small claims court, everything suggests professional-level legal planning." "But it's all based on lies," I protested. "The recordings are edited, the documents are forged, and the witnesses have been manipulated." Jake nodded sympathetically. "I believe you completely. But proving that in court will require expert testimony about audio forensics and document analysis that could cost more than the lawsuit is seeking. And judges in small claims court tend to trust community members over technical experts." He pulled out his laptop and showed me similar cases from around the country. "There's a pattern here of elaborate fraud schemes targeting inheritance recipients. The perpetrators usually disappear after winning small claims judgments because the amounts are too small for extensive appeals or federal investigation." As we talked, I realized Mrs. Patterson had calculated everything perfectly. The lawsuit amount was large enough to force me to sell my cabin, but small enough to avoid triggering serious criminal investigation. The 2-week timeline prevented me from mounting an effective defense, and the community witness testimony would be nearly impossible to refute without expensive expert analysis. "There's something else?" Jake said hesitantly. I did some research on Derek Patterson. His bar license was suspended in Nevada 3 years ago for ethical violations involving fraudulent document preparation. He shouldn't be practicing law anywhere. My heart raced with the first hope I had felt in days. Then the whole case is invalid, right? Not necessarily. In small claims, court parties can represent themselves or use non-attorney representatives. Derek is technically representing his sister-in-law as a family member not practicing law professionally. It's another gray area that's hard to challenge quickly. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Brittany. The poor girl was probably anxiously waiting to hear about her Stanford financial aid while her mother orchestrated this elaborate theft. Mrs. Patterson was destroying multiple families for money, using a young woman's dreams as justification for fraud. I decided to drive past Stanford again, hoping to find some way to contact Brittany directly. But as I pulled into the campus parking lot, I realized that approaching her could be construed as witness intimidation or stalking. Mrs. Patterson had trapped me in a situation where any attempt to reveal the truth could be twisted into additional legal charges. Instead, I sat in my car and called my grandfather's old friend Walter, who had helped him build the cabin 70 years ago. Walter was 86 now, but his voice was strong when he answered the phone. "Quinn boy, I heard about your troubles," Walter said. "Your grandfather would be rolling in his grave knowing someone was trying to steal that cabin through trickery." "I don't know what to do, Walter. She's got half the neighborhood convinced I'm some kind of deadbeat who breaks promises to young people." Walter was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandfather built that cabin with his own hands during the Depression, you know? Used lumber he cut himself and stones he pulled from the lake bottom. He always said it would be a place where his family could find peace when the world got too complicated." His words reminded me why I was fighting. The cabin wasn't just property. It was my family's history built with love and intended to provide sanctuary for future generations. Mrs. Patterson was trying to steal that legacy to fund her daughter's education at Stanford, an institution the girl could probably attend through legitimate financial aid if her mother wasn't so busy committing fraud. "Walter, do you know anyone who might help me investigate Mrs. Patterson's background? I have a feeling this isn't her first time pulling this kind of scheme." "As a matter of fact, I do," Walter replied with sudden energy. "My granddaughter Maria works as a private investigator in the city, specializes in fraud cases involving elderly victims and property theft. She's helped several folks in situations similar to yours." I felt the first spark of hope in days. "Can you give me her contact information?" "Already texting it to you," Walter said. "Maria Rodriguez. Tell her I sent you and she'll take good care of your situation." As I drove home that night, I realized Mrs. Patterson had made a critical error. She had assumed I would be too isolated and overwhelmed to mount an effective defense against her elaborate scheme. But by targeting my family's most precious legacy, she had awakened something in me that wouldn't be intimidated by fake legal papers or manipulated community testimony. It was time to stop being reactive and start taking control of this situation. Mrs. Patterson wanted to play legal games with my inheritance, but she was about to discover that some family legacies were worth fighting for no matter the cost. Maria Rodriguez met me at a small diner on the outskirts of town, choosing a corner booth where we could talk privately. She was younger than I had expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of our surroundings. Her handshake was firm, and her voice carried the confidence of someone who had dealt with fraud cases before. "Walter told me about your situation," she said, pulling out a tablet and stylus. "Before we start, I want you to know that what you're describing sounds like a very sophisticated operation. If Mrs. Patterson is running the kind of scheme I think she is, we're dealing with professional criminals." I handed her copies of all the documents Derek had provided, along with my notes about the doctored recordings and manipulated evidence. Maria studied everything with the intensity of a detective examining crime scene evidence. "The quality of these forgeries is impressive," she noted, holding one of the fake bank statements up to the light. "This level of document manipulation requires specialized software and experience with financial institution formatting. Most neighborhood grifters couldn't produce work this sophisticated." She opened her tablet and began typing rapidly. "I'm going to start with basic background checks on Linda Patterson and Derek Patterson. Sometimes these operations use false identities or have histories in other states. While Maria worked, I told her everything about the community manipulation, the Stanford fraud, and the workplace sabotage. She nodded grimly, occasionally asking specific questions about dates and details. "Quinn, I need to warn you that investigating this kind of fraud can uncover information that's difficult to process," Maria said gently. "If Mrs. Patterson is running elaborate cons involving property theft and identity manipulation, there are probably other victims who don't even realize they've been targeted." After 2 hours of initial research, Maria's expression had shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm. "Quinn, we have a serious problem. Linda Patterson isn't who she claims to be." She turned her tablet screen toward me, showing public record searches that painted a disturbing picture. "Her real name appears to be Linda Watson, and she's been using the Patterson identity for approximately 4 years. The real Derek Patterson died in a car accident in Nevada 3 years ago, and someone has been using his identity documents since then." My stomach dropped. "So the Derek who served me papers isn't really her brother-in-law. Worse than that, the man claiming to be Derek Patterson is actually Marcus Thompson, a disbarred attorney who is sanctioned for document fraud in Arizona. He and Linda Watson appear to be partners in an interstate con operation targeting recent inheritance recipients." Maria pulled up court records from Nevada and Arizona, showing a pattern of similar lawsuits. In Nevada, they convinced an elderly man named Robert Chen that he owed $37,000 in damages for supposedly destroying Linda's prized garden. In Arizona, they sued a young couple for $42,000, claiming their dog had attacked Linda's cat, requiring expensive veterinary treatment. The scope of their operation was breathtaking. They've done this before, multiple times, and they're very good at it. They research targets, carefully identify vulnerable people with recent windfalls, then manufacture elaborate scenarios that justify significant financial demands. The amounts are always calculated to be less expensive than fighting lengthy legal battles. Maria showed me newspaper articles from both states describing the successful lawsuits. In each case, Linda Watson and Marcus Thompson had disappeared shortly after receiving settlement payments, leaving no forwarding addresses. "But what about Brittany? Is she part of the scheme?" Maria's expression softened. "That's where this gets really tragic. I found records indicating that Brittany Rodriguez is Linda's daughter from a previous marriage, and her biological father is actually Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, currently deployed overseas with the Army. My hands clenched into fists. Rodriguez, are you related? He's my cousin, Maria said quietly. And he has no idea what's happening to his daughter. Marcus has been sending money every month to support Brittany's education, but Linda has been intercepting and redirecting all his payments. The cruelty was staggering. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just stealing my property, she was destroying a military family, manipulating her own daughter, and stealing money from a soldier serving overseas. Maria pulled up banking records that showed the true extent of Linda's theft. Marcus has sent over $63,000 in the past 18 months, believing it was going into Brittany's college fund. Linda has been depositing the money into personal accounts while telling Brittany that her father abandoned them. Can we contact him? I already have. Marcus is currently stationed in Germany, and he's been desperate to contact Brittany. Linda told him that Brittany was angry about his deployment and didn't want any communication. He's been respecting what he thought were his daughter's wishes while continuing to send financial support. Maria showed me emails from Marcus expressing heartbreak about his daughter's supposed rejection while faithfully sending money for her education. Linda had destroyed their relationship while profiting from his love and sense of duty. There's more, Maria continued. Linda has been filing false reports with Veterans Services claiming Marcus abandoned his family and stopped providing financial support. She's been collecting additional assistance benefits based on these fraudulent claims. The investigation revealed that Linda Watson and Marcus Thompson had been operating their interstate fraud scheme for at least 5 years, targeting recent inheritance recipients, elderly homeowners, and military families. They researched victims through social media, public records, and community infiltration before launching elaborate cons designed to extract maximum money while minimizing criminal exposure. They specifically target people dealing with grief or major life transitions, Maria explained. Recent inheritance recipients are perfect victims because they're emotionally vulnerable and often feel guilty about sudden wealth. Linda probably researched your grandfather's death through obituaries and public estate filings. As I absorbed this information, I felt my anger transforming into cold determination. Linda Watson had chosen the wrong target when she decided to steal my family's cabin to fund her criminal operation. And Marcus Thompson had made a fatal error by involving an innocent young woman and her deployed father in their scheme. Maria, what do we need to do to stop them? We're going to gather evidence of interstate fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Then we're going to contact federal authorities and reunite Brittany with her father while protecting your property. Maria's smile was sharp as a blade. Linda Watson thought she found another easy mark. But she's about to discover that some families fight back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had allies instead of just problems. Mrs. Patterson had declared war on multiple families, but she was about to learn that some battles have consequences she never anticipated. Maria's investigation moved with military precision over the next week. She had contacts throughout law enforcement and financial institutions who helped piece together the full scope of Linda Watson's criminal operation. By Friday, we had evidence that would destroy her scheme and probably send both her and Marcus Thompson to federal prison. Quinn, you need to see this, Maria said, spreading documents across her office conference table. Linda has been systematically draining Brittany's legitimate college fund while using the girl as an unwitting accomplice in multiple fraud schemes. The banking records were damning. Marcus Rodriguez had established a college fund for Brittany before his deployment, depositing $163,000 specifically designated for her Stanford education. Linda had been making unauthorized withdrawals for 18 months, claiming emergency expenses while hiding the fund's existence from Brittany. The girl genuinely believes her family is facing financial hardship, Maria explained. Linda has been showing Brittany fake financial documents indicating poverty while secretly stealing money that could have covered her Stanford expenses twice over. But the cruelest revelation was yet to come. Marcus had been sending additional monthly payments beyond the college fund, unaware that Linda was intercepting every communication attempt between father and daughter. "Look at these," Maria said, showing me printed emails. "Marcus has been trying to video chat with Brittany every week for the past year." Linda told him Brittany was too angry about his deployment to speak with him, so he's been respecting what he thought were her wishes while continuing to send financial support. I read Marcus's heartbroken messages describing his excitement about Brittany's Stanford acceptance and his plans to surprise her by covering any remaining costs beyond the college fund. He had no idea that Linda was manipulating both him and his daughter while stealing their money to fund her criminal lifestyle. "There's more," Maria continued. "Linda has been filing fraudulent reports with multiple veterans assistance programs claiming Marcus abandoned his family and stopped providing support. She's collected over $47,000 in additional benefits based on these lies." The scope of Linda's theft was staggering. She had stolen from Marcus from Brittany from veteran services and was attempting to steal my inherited property, all while destroying family relationships and traumatizing the people she was supposed to love. "We need to contact Marcus immediately," I said. Maria smiled. "I already have. He's arranging emergency leave to return to the States and deal with this situation. He'll be here Monday morning just in time for your court hearing." But our investigation had uncovered something even more important than evidence of Linda's current crimes. Maria had found records proving that Marcus Thompson, the man claiming to be Derek Patterson, had been using fraudulent legal documents to intimidate victims across multiple states. Thompson's disbarment was for exactly this kind of fraud, Maria explained. He creates fake legal papers that look official, but contain subtle errors that reveal their fraudulent nature. The problem is that most victims never have the documents analyzed by experts. She showed me comparison documents from Thompson's previous cases revealing identical formatting errors and legal language that no legitimate attorney would use. Thompson had been recycling the same fraudulent templates for years, simply changing names and amounts while maintaining the same basic structure. "The preliminary lien against your cabin is completely invalid," Maria said. "Thompson filed it using forged judicial signatures and non-existent case numbers. Your property was never actually encumbered, but it would take expensive legal action to prove that without this evidence." As we prepared for Monday's court hearing, Maria helped me understand the strategy. We're not just defending against their lawsuit. We're exposing an interstate criminal conspiracy involving identity theft fraud and theft from military families. Will that be enough to stop them? Quinn, by Monday afternoon, Linda Watson and Marcus Thompson will be in federal custody. The FBI has been tracking similar fraud patterns across multiple states, and our evidence provides the missing links they needed to build a comprehensive case. That weekend, I drove to my grandfather's cabin for what might be the last time before the legal battle concluded. Sitting on the dock where he had taught me to fish, I thought about the 5 generations of family memories Linda Watson was trying to steal for her criminal operation. My phone rang as the sun set over the lake. It was Marcus Rodriguez calling from Germany. "Quinn? I can't thank you and Maria enough for uncovering this situation," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been sending money every month while believing my daughter hated me. Linda convinced me that Brittany was ashamed of having a military father and didn't want any contact. Marcus, your daughter, has no idea about any of this. Linda has been manipulating her just like she manipulated everyone else. I know. I've been watching Brittany's social media posts, and she's been writing about missing her father and hoping he'll come home safely. Linda was lying to both of us while stealing money I sent for Brittany's future." Marcus paused, and I could hear the pain in his voice. "Quinn, I want you to know that even if Linda hadn't stolen the money Brittany's college fund already covers her Stanford expenses completely. There was never any need for you to sell your family's property. Linda created this entire crisis for her own profit. As we talked, I realized that Linda Watson's scheme had accidentally created something she never intended: a connection between families who shared common values about protecting the people we love. Marcus and I both understood the importance of legacy, whether it was a lakefront cabin built by previous generations or a college education funded by military service. Monday morning arrived gray and cold with storm clouds gathering over the courthouse. But as I walked up the steps with Maria and our boxes of evidence, I felt calm for the first time in weeks. Linda Watson and Marcus Thompson were about to discover that some people refused to be victims of elaborate fraud schemes. They had underestimated the power of truth, the dedication of professional investigators, and the determination of families who fight back when their most precious legacies are threatened. The courthouse was packed Monday morning with faces I recognized from Mrs. Patterson's neighborhood meeting. Tom and Linda sat in the front row, along with several other neighbors who expected to watch me finally honor my supposed commitment to Brittany's education. They had no idea they were about to witness the exposure of an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Mrs. Patterson, Linda Watson, arrived wearing a conservative black dress and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested serious legal business. Marcus Thompson followed in his expensive navy suit, projecting the confidence of an attorney who had never lost this kind of case. But their expressions shifted to concern when they noticed the additional people in the courtroom. Maria sat beside me with boxes of evidence, and 3 individuals in dark suits had positioned themselves near the exits. Linda's eyes darted nervously between the strangers, perhaps recognizing the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Judge Patricia Williams called the case to order at 9:30 sharp. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had handled thousands of small claims disputes, but something in her expression suggested this case was different from typical neighborhood disagreements. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Williams began, "before we proceed with testimony, I need to verify your credentials to represent Mrs. Patterson in this matter." Thompson stood confidently. "Your Honor, I'm representing my sister-in-law as a family member, which is permitted under small claims procedures." "I see, and your legal background?" "I practiced law in Nevada before relocating to assist with family matters." Judge Williams consulted papers that Maria had filed with the court earlier that morning. "Mr. Thompson, are you aware that the State Bar of Nevada suspended your license 3 years ago for ethical violations involving fraudulent document preparation?" The color drained from Thompson's face. "Your Honor, those charges were based on misunderstandings, and this case doesn't require active bar membership since I'm providing family assistance rather than professional legal services." "I understand. However, I've also received information suggesting that your claimed family relationship may be based on fraudulent identity documentation. Would you like to address that before we proceed?" Thompson's confidence evaporated entirely. He glanced toward Linda, who was staring at the federal agents with growing panic. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, "I've been contacted by the FBI regarding potential interstate fraud involving the parties in this case. Agent Sarah Mitchell, would you like to address the court and that's transt?" One of the dark-suited individuals stood up displaying federal credentials. "Your Honor, we have arrest warrants for Linda Watson, also known as Mrs. Patterson, and Marcus Thompson for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and theft from military families." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs as neighbors realized they had been manipulated into supporting criminal activities. Linda Watson tried to stand, but Agent Mitchell was already approaching her with handcuffs. "Linda Watson, you're under arrest for interstate fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for practicing law without a license, document fraud, and conspiracy." As the agents read their rights, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the nightmare was ending, but sadness for the neighbors who had been deceived and for Brittany, whose world was about to be turned upside down. Judge Williams addressed the remaining courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case involves sophisticated criminal fraud that has deceived multiple victims across several states. The evidence will show that Mrs. Patterson systematically manipulated community members and family relationships to support elaborate theft schemes. But the most important moment came when the courtroom doors opened and a man in army dress uniform walked in. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez was younger than I had expected, with kind eyes that immediately began searching the crowd. "Daddy," a voice called from the back of the courtroom. I turned to see Brittany Rodriguez standing near the entrance, tears streaming down her face. She had apparently arrived to support who she believed was her mother, only to discover her father was alive, present, and had never abandoned her. Marcus rushed to his daughter, embracing her while she sobbed against his chest. "Brittany, I've been trying to reach you for months. I never stopped loving you or supporting your education. I've been sending money every week, but your mother was intercepting everything. She told me you were angry about deployment and didn't want to talk to me," Brittany whispered. "I've been writing letters you never received and missing you every day." Judge Williams allowed father and daughter time to reunite while Agent Mitchell explained the investigation's findings. Linda Watson had stolen over $247,000 through various fraud schemes, including money Marcus had sent for his daughter's education and benefits fraudulently claimed from veteran services. The good news, Agent Mitchell announced, is that Brittany's legitimate college fund remains intact, and Stanford University has been notified about the fraudulent financial aid documents. Miss Rodriguez's education will proceed as originally planned by her father. As the courtroom cleared, several neighbors approached me with embarrassed apologies. Tom shook his head sadly. "Quinn, I'm sorry we believed her stories. She was very convincing about your supposed promises." "Mrs. Watson is a professional con artist," I replied. "She manipulated all of us using sophisticated psychological techniques. Don't blame yourselves for trusting someone who seemed like a caring neighbor." Robert Hayes, our neighborhood association president, looked shaken. "I keep thinking about how enthusiastic she was about community involvement. She volunteered for every committee and seemed to genuinely care about neighborhood improvements." Maria explained that successful con artists always integrate themselves deeply into community life, building trust and credibility before launching their schemes. Linda Watson had spent months establishing herself as a caring single mother and good neighbor, creating the foundation for her elaborate property theft operation. But the most meaningful resolution came later that afternoon. Marcus and Brittany visited my house to express their gratitude for exposing Linda's fraud and reuniting their family. "Mr. Quinn," Brittany said, "I'm so sorry my mother tried to steal your cabin. I had no idea she was lying about everything. I thought you had really promised to help and then changed your mind. Brittany, you were a victim just like everyone else. Your mother manipulated your emotions and used your love for her to participate in fraud without realizing it." Marcus shook my hand firmly. "Quinn, Linda destroyed our family relationship while stealing money I sent for Brittany's future. You and Maria gave me my daughter back and exposed crimes that could have continued for years. What will happen to Brittany's Stanford education?" Marcus smiled. "The college fund I established covers everything, and I've been saving additional money that Linda never knew about. Brittany's education is completely secure and she'll graduate debt-free." As they prepared to leave, Brittany turned back. "Mr. Quinn, could I visit your cabin sometime? Not because of any obligation, but because I'd like to understand the place my mother tried to steal. Your grandfather sounds like an amazing person. Brittany, you and your father are welcome at the cabin anytime. It's a place for family and friends, and after everything we've been through together, you're both family now." 6 months later, I received an invitation to Brittany's Stanford freshman orientation ceremony. She was thriving academically and had established a support group for children of deployed military parents. Marcus had completed his deployment and found work as a veterans counselor helping other military families avoid financial fraud. The cabin remains in our family, just as my grandfather intended. But now it serves a broader purpose, hosting weekend retreats for military families dealing with deployment stress and providing peaceful sanctuary for people recovering from fraud victimization. Linda Watson and Marcus Thompson were sentenced to federal prison for conspiracy fraud and identity theft. Their arrest helped solve similar cases in 6 other states, protecting dozens of potential victims from elaborate property theft schemes. I learned that standing up to manipulation and fraud requires courage, professional help, and sometimes federal intervention. But more importantly, I discovered that protecting your family's legacy can create unexpected opportunities for genuine human connection and mutual support. The experience taught me that evil people often disguise themselves as caring neighbors and helpful family members, using trust and community bonds to facilitate their crimes. But it also showed me that truth persistence and professional investigation can expose even the most sophisticated deception. My grandfather built that cabin as a place where his family could find peace when the world became too complicated. Linda Watson tried to steal that peace for her own profit, but ultimately, her criminal scheme brought together families who shared common values about protecting the people we love. Sometimes the worst attacks on what matters most to us reveal the strength we never knew we possessed and create connections with people who become lifelong friends. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor or family member who tried to manipulate you into giving up something precious? How did you handle the situation? And what advice would you give to others facing similar manipulation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else recognize and resist elaborate fraud schemes. Please give this story a like. If it resonated with you, subscribe for more true stories about standing up to manipulation and protecting what matters most. And share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how sophisticated fraud schemes operate. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that your family's legacy is worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the people trying to steal it might seem.